celled organisms, this is the story. When they are done leading their regular little cell lives, they make a copy of their DNA, they pack it up, right? They form into those chromosomes, and then the nucleus is going to dissolve. I don't love this diagram because it kind of looks like the nucleus is always there. It's a bad diagram. I didn't realize that. I didn't pay close enough attention. Thought co, more like incorrect co. Am I right? Anyway, so makes a perfect copy of the DNA. During metaphase, the DNA is going to end up lined up at the middle because it's been connected by these fishing lines. Do you even remember what we call the little microtubules, these little lines that actually run in there, are called? So somebody, I think, said it. Spindle fibers. Sometimes you'll see the term astral rays. Ooh. I know. Yeah. Yeah. And then when they connect, those are now going to shorten. They're going to spool in. They're going to ream. What do we call these structures at both poles that produce the spindle fibers that go out in search of the DNA? Do we remember? It's a really dumb name because they're not remotely in the center of the cell, and yet they are called the centrioles. And they, by spindle fibers, connect to the middle of these pieces of DNA, which are called the centromeres. So the centriole produces spindle fibers, which connects to the DNA at the centromeres. And when these shorten, it's going to pull the copies apart. The result is that one copy ends up on one side, another copy ends up on the other side. We form new nuclei, and we cleave in half, leading us to cytokinesis, where we have two daughter cells. And for a single-celled organism, that's how they reproduce. And the daughter cells are now fully fledged living things, and they can go off in interphase and live their cell lives. You know, get their little cell house with a cell picket fence and get a pet, maybe. I don't know. Hi. Yeah, you bet. Yeah, you're good. But how does this relate to you? Because you aren't one cell, right? And we know we're not going to learn about human reproduction on this level, but you know that this is not how you reproduce, right? In other words, there won't come a day when you decide to split in half and now there's two daughter yous and the original you is no more, right? You understand that that is not how human reproduction works. Do humans undergo mitosis? Do humans undergo mitosis? What about cats? What about gerbils? What about carrots? Parsnips? Do parsnips undergo mitosis? Of them are undergoing mitosis. Because we don't use mitosis to make a new organism, but we do use it to make new cells. Does that make sense? Okay. So, why do cells divide? So again, for single-celled organisms, the answer is reproduction. For multicellular organisms, it's more complicated. It's not specifically for reproduction. In fact, reproduction is handled by a different mechanism called meiosis. It's related, but it's not the same. In multicellular organisms, the first thing to understand is a multicellular organism such as yourself starts out as how many cells? How many cells were you at your initial conception, the moment at which you came into being? Do you know? Not to get all birds and bees here, but how's a person get made? Like after the obvious part. Like, yeah, so sex, sexual intercourse, obviously, at which point males have sex cells called sperm, right? And during ejaculation, those get released into a woman's vagina, which makes its way up to the fallopian tubes, where they will encounter what? You guys have studied this, presumably? Yep. Yeah, the egg. The ovum, right? Which, again, The egg in the human is not something, like covered in calcium and that, like it's a different thing. But there's a single cell that a woman releases every month once she's reached menstruation. And that single cell is called an ovum. And one sperm and one ovum come together to form an embryo. So every single living human being, awesome, perfect. I will get finished for you. Every single person starts out as one cell. But now you are hundreds of trillions of cells. How does one cell become hundreds of trillions of cells? And the answer is mitosis. So the first function of mitosis in multicellular organisms is growth. The second is related to growth. So when you're first born, you're really little. You're a lot more than one cell, but even when you're born, you might have weighed 5 pounds, 6 pounds, 7 pounds, 8 pounds, 9 pounds, 10 pounds. I'll tell you this, I didn't weigh 250, 260. That definitely wasn't my birth weight. That'd be a problem, right? So between then and now, I gained a lot of cells, right? So growth. But you reach a certain age and you mostly stop growing. There are other ways to grow. But presumably, you reach your adult weight and now you're not growing anymore, but you still have to replace cells. So replacement of dead cells. And related to that, repair of damage. Those two are related to one another, but some cells die because they're supposed to die. Your skin cells are supposed to regularly die. On the other hand, I cut myself a couple of weeks ago in the kitchen, and then almost comically and farcically, about 5 minutes later, burned that exact same spot on a hot pan. I was having a rough day for this exact spot here. But I had a big, ugly, stupid wound there. But now it almost looks normal again, right? Because what has happened, all the cells that were damaged and destroyed, was that a hand? They reproduce. We get new cells there to take their place, right? Within limits, if you damage your tissues, they will repair themselves. Your body is capable of replacing them. There's a limit there. If I'd lost my whole arm, it's not going to replace itself. Though interestingly, the wound itself will heal, right? Yeah. Answer A, I have no freaking idea. Answer B, by mitosis. So in other words, their body plan is producing new cells that know how to replace that, but they have some mechanism in place that allows them to, while they heal, to heal much more serious damage than we do. Why that, and maybe at one point our ancestors also had that, and that's something that we lost along the way. Maybe that's something that they gained along the way. I don't know the answer to that, but just they have a different repair schema than we do, and theirs can handle repair of more serious damage. That's a half answer because obviously that would be a major field of study. I actually know the guy you'd want to ask. A professor I worked with at Brock, I worked in his lab for one summer, was a guy named Glenn Tattersall, studies reptiles in sort of serious detail. So he would be the guy who I'm sure could tell you in great detail. And the answer would be very complex because cell stuff is very, very, very complex. So let's quickly just talk about each of these. Multicellular organisms start as a single cell, typically. So at one point, you were in your mother's womb a single cell. Weird to think about. Very delicate, very, but that single cell underwent mitosis, after which point it was now, how many cells? 2. And those 2 single cells are able to undergo mitosis, after which point you would have been 4 cells. Those 4 can turn to 8, 8 to 16, 16 to 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096. I don't know where it goes after that. 8192. I don't know. Anyway, point being, big old numbers, right? And before you know it, zip, zoom, zam, all of a sudden, have you ever seen, like, did you have to watch, like, The Miracle Life or Some Such Thing in Health and see all the stages of, like, embryonic development? What do they teach you people? What? Tea? As in, like, if you take the leaves of a plant and dry them and then soak them in boiling water, you get tea? I'm confused. Anyway, we'll move on. Point being, what they should teach you is about embryonic development, at least to some extent. Oh, like tea as a model for consent. Okay, the one time I taught health, I used pizza as an example. No, you think about it. I mean, it makes sense, right? Pizza is something that people generally enjoy, but not everyone wants pizza all the time. And for you pizza, you can decide what you want on it, right? It's a conversation. And if one person's like, I really like pineapple, and someone else is like, no, pineapple doesn't belong on a pizza. If you're getting pizza together, you're going to not get pineapple on it, because in the end, you kind of got to agree on what people don't like, right? Anyway, that's long story short. Okay, well, in addition to tea, they should show you embryonic development, because it's wild, because it's absolutely wild. Like, you start off as a single cell, and a few weeks later, you're like the start of an organism, and you've got eyes, and you've got fingers, and you've got toes, and there's a heart that starts beating, and a brain that starts firing signals, and it happens very quickly, because mitosis can happen very quickly, and if you've taken exponential functions in math, if you keep multiplying by 2, try it on you probably did this at some point when you weren't paying attention in math class. You ever start just pressing multiply by 2 equals on your calculator and just seeing how big the number gets till the calculator breaks? It doesn't take very long for the calculator to break, right? If you keep dividing cells in 2, you can get big really quickly, right? So every step of mitosis, not every step of mitosis, every cycle of mitosis doubles the number of cells. And so quickly gets very big. And if you've ever grown plants, right, you put a little seed in the ground, and before you know it, it just starts growing to this thing. And like we did bean seeds in here a few years ago, and one of them got like enormous. It was like up to the ceiling. They don't always get that big, but they can get really big. When my kids were little, we used to make them a sunflower fort, where you would plant, you dig out of the grass the shape you want your fort to be. You can try this, and I'll tell you, I think this would still be fun at 16. You go with the grass, you get a shovel, and you dig out the shape that you want like your fort to be. So you're like, okay, I want my fort to be this shape, and then like, I want to have a wall here, and a wall there, but a doorway. And then you plant sunflower seeds all along the perimeter of those, and then between them, you plant bean seeds, and the sunflowers grow super tall and strong, and they make your wall, and then the beans grow up them, and they fill in the wall, and they also grow along the top and make a roof, and you make yourself a little fort. Tons of fun. Would recommend. Yeah. Kids used to love that. That was great. Be like, get out of my house. Go play somewhere. Right? So they get really big really quickly. That's the power of mitosis. Potentially, if every cell in your body underwent mitosis right now, 2 hours from now, you could be twice as big. Right? Now, to be clear, that's not going to happen. But you see the idea, right? Like if you just think about that as a matter of numbers, right? Like if every single cell in an organism were to undergo mitosis, you're talking about doubling that in no time flat, right? Now, in practice, not every cell undergoes mitosis. Is that a hand? Or no? Yeah. Yeah. What's up? So I'm just gonna get a little closer because I have old man here, so I don't hear well. Try again. Yeah. 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 Yeah, do this both. Every plant is both. Yeah, you all right. Yeah, but the actual fertilization is 1-to-1. So you are just like, that's a great question. If you didn't hear it, listen up. The question is, aren't you dealing with a bunch of plants? So like if you imagine like pollinating, right? Where you take pollen and each one of those contains a single sex cell. Pollen is the male sex cell of plants, and the seed contains the female sex cell. Even though you are putting lots of pollen on the seed, in the end it is a one-to-one relationship. Not unlike if you've ever seen the video of like when sperm meets egg, there'll be thousands of sperm around the egg, but in the end it is the implantation of one that results in fertilization, at which point you now have the zygote. Yeah. Sorry? A coffee.
The tears of his students.
Oh, yeah. I didn't buy this mug. That's not really my vibe, but that's a nice gift. I don't say no to gifts. We got our mess cleaned up.
It was already cleaned up.
Oh, even better.
I did a lot of talking. So
I don't know what that would be like. You're not supposed to laugh at that. You're supposed to be like, yeah, no, Orlando talks exactly the right amount all the time. Okay. So as organisms grow, I wouldn't need to write that, but organisms grow as a result of mitosis. You're able to grow from a small thing up to a big thing by mitosis. Now, of course, also repair. You get yourself an ugly little cut like that. Over time, it's going to fill itself in. So, when tissue is damaged, mitosis allows the production of new cells to replace damaged ones. That was really good. Okay. So we'll take a minute to write that. And that's the basic idea. That is how this process, mitosis, plays out in multicellular organisms like you and like me, but also like plants, right? Because plants are also big multicellular organisms that reproduce sexually. And as such, they undergo a similar process. And plants too repair themselves, right? Like if you've ever carved your name into a tree, anyone ever done this? You get a pocket knife and you're like, yeah. Or like you carve a heart and then you put like your initials and then somebody you'll love forever's initials also in that heart. And that will never change. It always still applies, hypothetically speaking. And that, it doesn't look the same a few weeks later. It's healed up a bit, right? There'll still be a scar, just like, the emotional scar is left behind by the relationship that ended with the person you put in that heart. But still, and also just like the physical scar that we get when we repair, because trees will repair the damage, right? Assuming they're able. Now, obviously, if enough damage happens, then an organism can die, right? They can't keep up. So you got your little finger like this, you'll be all right. I think it's a finger. That looks more like a finger than a toe to me. What do we think? Definitely a finger, yeah. I'm thinking index finger. Anyway, so there we go. Now, here's the one thing, though. If I had damage to my finger here, it would be pretty weird if it got replaced by like a cell like the one in my eye that likes to turn all brown and like shimmery looking. That'd be weird, right? Be weird, but that doesn't happen. You get damaged and skin cells get replaced by skin cells, right? And as we're growing, it'd be pretty weird if all of a sudden like fingernails started coming like out of like your cheek, but that doesn't happen, right? In other words, when we replace a cell, we can't just replace it with any old cell. We have to replace it with the same kind of cell. How do we have different kinds of cells if we start off as just one cell? You know what I mean? You started off as one cell, but now you're a bunch of cells, but your cells aren't all the same. You're not like this big gloppy mess of all the same cells. You've got skin cells, and you've got bone cells, and you've got muscle cells and nerve cells, and you've got all different kinds of cells. Yeah. Good thinking And that was what scientists probably thought, right? Not probably thought, that was the initial assumption, was that would be the case. But as it turns out, when we study it, your skin cells have the exact same DNA as the cells of your eye, have the exact same DNA as the cells in your heart muscle, have the exact same DNA as the cells in your pinky toe. They're all the same DNA. So it's actually even cooler than that. The DNA contains instructions not to make one kind of cell. The DNA actually contains the instructions to make all of the cells. And even crazier, it also contains the instructions of how to arrange them. Hey, if you're over here in the body, you're going to turn into this kind of cell. Hey, if you're over here in the body, you're going to turn into this kind of cell. And the thing I always think about is just, especially I have the worst facial hair on planet Earth. I have the facial hair of like a prepubescent. Yeah, it's terrible. It's the worst. But you know people who have that really sharp line in their facial hair where like they shave in the morning and then my high school gym teacher, Albino Pereira, that guy, you could tell he shaved at lunch because when he got to school at 8 in the morning, he was clean shaven. By 9:15, he had like just gray, like visible shape of his beard. And then after lunch, he was clean shaven again. And then by 2 in the afternoon, he just had one of those beards that like you could like calibrate a ruler with. Like it was a perfect shape. Do you know what I'm talking about? Think about that for a minute. How in God's name does the body as it's growing know like, okay, we're going to put the kind of cells that make hair on the face until we get here. And then when we get here, nope, stop, right? And like on his body, perfect straight line. And you've probably seen people like that, right? And even if you don't with the facial hair, think about your eyebrows. You know, here, hair. Go up 1 millimeter, no hair. Down 1 millimeter, no hair. How in God's name does your cells know to do that? And the answer is coded in the DNA is not just how to make a cell that is a skin cell that doesn't make hair, but is the code of how to make a skin cell that does make hair. And then the body plan to say, this is where these ones go, this is where the other ones go. And this is how we know the difference and how we keep track. That's pretty crazy stuff, right? This is true. I don't know about you, but if I don't pluck it, I get a big old unibrow. So I make sure to pluck it because I think that looks weird. But again, if you're into that, that's more power to you. So this is where it gets really crazy. Complex multicellular organisms have different types of cell. For this purpose, after mitosis, the daughter cells produced are often specific. So in our body, we have something called stem cells. Stem cells are cells in our body that undergo mitosis. So your skin cells don't undergo mitosis. But under your skin, you have stem cells that do. And they will then develop into skin cells. After mitosis, cells will specialize, which is to say, develop the traits of their type of cell. Now, this is an oversimplification because there are some stem cells that we call pluripotent stem cells. These are stem cells that can turn into any kind of cell afterwards. Those are present in really high proportions in like fetuses. And that makes a lot of sense because a fetus is making lots of new cells quickly. In adults, most of your stem cells are already partially specialized. So you would have stem cells that are precursors to skin cells, but they could still turn into like 5 different types of skin cells, but they'll never turn into a muscle cell. And then you'll have stem cells that will, when they undergo mitosis, become, so your body even pre-specializes. We're not going to mention that here, but I just want to mention it out loud so you're aware that it's complex, because boy, is it complex. This is why there's a lot of controversy, by the way, because for stem cell research, researching into stem cells, the best source for stem cells are the least specialized, which is present in fetuses. And when I was your age, there was a lot of debate over whether, if somebody has an abortion, whether scientists should be permitted to use the stem cells present in that fetus for research. which is a practice that largely scientists have agreed is sort of something to be frowned upon, sort of for ethical reasons. But you can see how that's a concern, right? Interesting discussion to think about, right? If a woman's choosing to have an abortion and aborting a fetus, is it ethical for scientists to use those cells to further our understanding of how development works? I don't think there's one right or wrong answer to that. I think that's something that you sort of have to think your way through. But these, by the way, are the types of things scientists have to think about, right? Keep in mind that everything you learn in biology, we've learned by studying organisms, right? We're going to do a dissection here. For us to do a dissection, the animal has to die, right? We source animals that, to the best of my knowledge, for the larger ones, have died. For example, our fetal pigs, pigs that go to be slaughtered for the food industry aren't supposed to be pregnant. And if they are, the meat industry isn't allowed to use the fetuses for food, which I think we can all agree, good. And so that's where these get purchased. Basically mistakes in the slaughtering process. And those will end up there. But on the other hand, our frog specimens, someone just goes out and collects them and kills them, right? So that's something to keep in mind, right? That, like, these are organisms that were collected for science. So you had a question? Yeah, and that in the end is what lots of places do. But there's still debate of whether that's ethical for scientists to do, right? So it's like, yeah, right? Because you got to think, like, abortion of itself is a contentious ethical debate, right? Like, people have lots of questions about whether or not that's something people should be doing. And that's not something I want to wade to in this class right now, but that's certainly an interesting discussion to have. So now if you take the next step and say, well, what about using the product of that process for scientific study? Again, that's bound to be something that, butts heads against different people, right? And some people would say, well, listen, if the woman's having the procedure anyway, and that tissue, the option is use it for science or don't, and the fetus is equally deceased at the end of it, it only makes sense. And somebody else would say, that's still the fruit of something unethical, right? And these are hot topics, issues for big debate. I took a bioethics class in university. I was briefly a philosophy major, and when I got back into biochem, I wanted to kind of focus on that. My bioethics class was one of the most interesting things I ever took. I really enjoyed it. Yeah. So I'm going to get close again. Being an old man again. Yes. Yeah, I got one in the back. Yeah, I got my baby pig bin in the back. It's my turtle bin and my shark bin and my frog bin. A little bit, right? And my bin of hearts and my bin of livers. And I just ordered some brains. Cheap brains. Yeah. Yeah. There's some like it. There's not much. Yeah. And I should say, if you leave them to dry out, they'll be specimens. They should be. If they were in the bags, like sometimes they come in vacuum sealed bags, there's just there's a little liquid in there, there's some. And if they're just in the bucket, then there should be liquid over them that will protect the grain. Yeah. Like not normal, but in this case. All right, so this process is important. And listen, look here, you don't need to know what erythroid cells are yet, you will, or structural cells, but the idea is you start with one basic cell, and each of these arrows is mitosis, and then specialization. Does that make sense? The stem cell will undergo mitosis, and it's the daughter cells that will specialize into different functional cells. Specialized cells perform specific functions in the body. Your body has hundreds, I think even thousands of types of cells that have specialized functions. We are not going to learn about each one for, I think, rather obvious reasons. But we are going to learn about the major types or the major categories of specialized cells. So I'll give you a minute to write that, and then we'll a little something below. So human somatic cells, and somatic is a fancy sounding word that just means not sex cells. So sex cells are their own category. And again, in males, the sex cell is spermatozoa, and in biological females, the sex cell is ova. But all the other cells, the somatic cells, are divided into 4 basic categories. The first of which, I just got to make sure I didn't then leave a space on the next. Okay, I didn't. Good. The first of which, we're going to talk about muscle cells. What do muscle cells do? Like there's some, sorry? Beautiful. Exactly right. That's the only thing they're able to do. All a muscle cell can do is contract and relax. Tighten and loosen. And when they contract, they get shorter. All a muscle cell does is a cell that is designed, if you zap it with a little bit of electricity, it gets shorter. And if you put a bunch of those together, thousands and thousands and thousands of them together, and they all get shorter, you can move something. And we have, so they are contractile, they get shorter. Contractile cells used for movement. All right? And there's 2 main types. The first type would be what we call our skeletal muscle cells. And those are used to move the whole body. So this is movement of the body. Does anyone know the second? There's actually 3 main types. Sorry, I said 2. The second one is very important. It gets its own specific category. These types of muscles run constantly. Cardiac muscle cells. Where are they found? What's cardiac mean? The heart. Very good. These are actually different enough from the other muscle cells in your body that they get their own category. So these are the muscles of the heart. And does anyone know the third type? A general thing we call smooth muscle cells. And these are found, so the skeletal muscles, if you look at them under a microscope, they're striated. They have all these stripes on them, very visibly. These are found in organs. So, for example, your stomach has all these valves that prevent food from getting out back into the esophagus or going into the intestines before they're ready, and those valves are controlled by smooth muscle. Right, so your esophagus is surrounded by smooth muscle, which can squeeze it, which allows food to go down into your stomach. So that's the first type, muscle cells. Second type, your cardiac muscle cells beat, right? They shorten and squeeze the blood in your heart. But what tells them to beat? Well, the answer is, interestingly, your heart is not actually directly connected to your brain. Your heart has its own little brain. It has something called the sinoatrial node, often better known as the pacemaker. But it's the same idea, which is it gets nervous cells. These send electrochemical signals. Electrochemical signals throughout the body. So your phone or my computer or a vending machine or the microscope or the lights in this room work because we have little copper wires that we can send electrical signals down. Your body actually works on a very similar principle as a computer. It's just a big mess of circuits, of vessels that carry electrical signals, only they don't use copper wire to do it. They use nerve cells. And they're not conductive by just sending electricity. They have a different mechanism, something called action potential. Take grade 12 biology, you'll learn all about it. But having said that, it's the same basic idea. Computers are circuits of electrical wires. Your body's nervous system is a collection of electrical wires in the form of nervous cells. These are called neurons. So you'll see nervous cells or neurons. Oh boy, I wrote that too big. There's 4 types, and look at me, I'm like using it all up. If you find that you've also written way too big, you can probably sneak on to the next page, but I'm going to shrink this down like that. I'm sorry. I got excited. I was writing big. Okay, 3rd type. This is a big category. Connective cells. Connective tissue is just kind of cells that hold things together. But this is a big, broad category. There's a lot of things they throw into this category. For example, they throw blood cells into this category, which I think is a real stretch. But these are basically cells that hold the body together. Carry nutrients, etc. This is a big category. You could even put that. A lot of different cells fall under the catch-all of connective cells. And then the 4th is a word that I hate saying, so I'm going to let you try. That was pretty good, actually. Yeah, that was very close. Epithelial. And these are protective. These line sensitive organisms, sensitive tissues, to protect them from damage. So, for example, around your heart is something called the pericardium. It's this very, very thin membrane that's incredibly tough. And if you want to get to the heart, you have to cut through it. It's there to protect the heart from damage, from infection, from things like that. If you've ever, if anyone has ever made sausage before, or even if you've ever had to clean an animal after hunting or clean a fish after fishing, you've come across a lot of protective tissues, right? These membranes that separate one area from another and hold things together, but also protect them. Just about every major organ is protected by a layer of epithelial cells. And anytime your body is in contact with the outside world, so your epidermis, all of your outer skin, that's all epithelial tissue. It's all protective. The tissue that makes up your lips and the inner lining of your mouth, epithelial tissue, all down your alimentary canal, so all the way through your digestive tract. The inner layer of all that is epithelium to protect that because it's coming into contact with the outside world. Oh, good. Okay. The last thing I wanted to say is stem cells are necessarily in complex organisms. Again, as we set up above, I just want to note stem cells themselves become specialized in complex organisms. I.e., there are cells that serve as stem cells only for new skin cells. Or blood cells, etc. For example, does anyone know where the stem cells that produce our red blood cells are? Does anyone know where most of your red blood cells get produced? Some small amount in your liver, some small amount actually in your kidneys and your thalamus, but most of your red blood cells are produced where? Very interesting place. Maybe not the place you'd expect. Does anyone know? Your bones. Your bone, but specifically, not like the tough outer part of your bone. What's in the middle of your bones? Yeah. Marrow. Yeah, so for whatever reason, the tissue inside your bone marrow, which serves a few functions, but one of the functions that actually one of the functions, let's try it a third time. One of the functions it actually serves is to produce red blood cells for your body.
So now you can go home and have the lovely thought that your bones are full of blood.
It's weird, right? But have you ever heard of somebody having to get a bone marrow transplant before? I had a really interesting situation. I have a friend who had cancer of the bone marrow and had to get a transplant. I don't know all the details, but here's what I know. She found a compatible donor who was her brother, who was willing to donate. This was a serious operation. They were both out of operation for like a full year in recovery. She lives in Switzerland. But she got her brother's bone marrow transplant into her, and her blood type changed. How weird is that? Because her bone marrow that is producing her blood cells now isn't her own, but actually belonged to her brother, who had a different blood type than she did. And so her blood type now is different than it was before her treatment. Isn't that wild?
I remember for a while she had both her original blood types.
I suspect she probably still does. I don't know the details, but I can't, obviously she didn't have all of her bone marrow replaced, right? I'm assuming. So presumably it's still a mix. But I would imagine that probably the long bones of the arms and legs are responsible for most. That's a guess, but that seems like a good guess. But mind you, the body's so confusing, you'll end up discovering it's some small bone in your leg or something. You know what I mean? The one thing you learn in biology is that you can never just assume oh, this makes sense, because you cannot possibly fathom how complicated your body is. It is just, the more you study it, the less you know, in the weirdest possible way. Because every single thing you learn, you discover that there's 10 things that you'd always just taken for granted that it turns out you don't know. And then the next thing you learn, all that happens is you discover 10 new things that you didn't know. Your body is astonishingly complicated. Just one of your cells is astonishingly complicated, but you're not made of one cell. You're made of trillions of cells, and each of them is just so impossibly complex that you could spend a lifetime studying it and barely scratch the surface, which is at one time really humbling. Another time it's really cool, right? It really, it always amazes me sort of to know, just sort of how complex that system is. That's it for